All right, let's keep talking about adolescence. We've got Beatall2 in the comments asking the question of what exactly is the castle in the sky or the power to revolutionize the world? Is that the power to grow from a child to an adult? And why are Anthe and Akio plotting to get it back? There's a number of things, and specifically, I didn't mention this in the last episode when it came up in the flashback because I want to talk about it a bit more when the Castle of Eternity becomes kind of a tangible obstacle in Anthe's escape sequence. I know that kind of sounds like a cop-out, and it's not that I have some secret, aha, eureka moment to describe what is a very complex and very abstract symbol. But instead, I think we can talk about like how it functions right now, and that's that it should be something motivating Utena, right? We said for the first part of this film that there really isn't any directive. There really isn't any passion behind why Utena would want to undergo any of these duels or any real motivation or goal for her ostensibly. So this is already by the time that she's, been invested in Anthe and her issues with Toga, and those have come to light, and then she's exposed kind of the supernatural driving force of what she should be doing, and that's the power to revolutionize the world. What exactly is that power? What does it mean? Or at least what is my take on it? I think that much like the eponymous penguin drum from Penguin Drum, I don't think it's as concrete a concept or even much less a physical entity or idea as all of that or that you might expect. Let's look at it literally. The power to revolutionize the world. We're talking about a hugely oppressive, conformist society where no one is allowed to exist outside of the expectations bestowed upon them. We talked in depth about this the last episode, but the power to revolutionize the world would literally be the power to change that world. Revolutionize is a word that doesn't necessarily have to be synonymous with change. But if the idea is a deep-seated recontextualizing or reevaluating of how the world, the entire system that they're stuck in works, then I think it's right for Anthe to want it or to laud it. But because I do believe society here to be the social forces at work, due to the myriad of things we've talked about already, I think that power over society, as we see, and as we talked about in, when we were talking about the feminist readings of this film, is not the power to accept or to embrace, not the power to destroy or tear down the culture, but the power to redefine the values and make your own decisions independent of the culture. So yeah, it is in that way growing up from a child to an adult, because an adult makes their own decisions. But it's also that, Ubermensch idea that we mentioned last episode. It's also the feminist ideal of, setting your own value systems for your sexuality and for your appearance and everything else. It's the self-actualization and self-respect to go along with that of the characters. And of course, the catch-22 is that Anthe has convinced herself that participating in the social structure of the duels and the prince is the way to obtain the power to revolutionize the world. Even though she's already seen somebody who was the consummate prince be unable to do that and be unable to handle that. Even though Akio was as far the prince as could possibly be in that system, he had made it, he had achieved it, he did not have the power to revolutionize the world. And indeed was almost completely beholden to it, and trapped all the more so for being the prince. We'll see a little bit of that with Toga coming up here. And Anthe knows all of that, yet she still buys into this unobtainable goal of the thing that's out of reach that they have to strive for. Why? Utena doesn't come up with that. She doesn't come up against it on her own. Seonji doesn't say anything about it. Juri sure as shit doesn't. I think the Castle of Eternity and the power to revolutionize the world definitely feels like a refinement of the series. Whereas in the series it's very much used and possibly abused to the point where it's kind of just lip service by the end. In the movie, the Castle of Eternity and the power to revolutionize the world is Anthe's construct. And perhaps it goes back to her role as the Rose Bride, something we actually haven't talked a lot about because I don't have a lot of meaning to put behind it. But I think this does go back to the idea of the powerful submissive Anthe. That whole bit of Akio saying, "Why must you torture me so?" If Anthe abstracted the Castle of Eternity as a goal, not a full delusion, but kind of a half-lie that she could tell herself, and she could lull herself into a sense of complacency so that she doesn't have to challenge herself on a very primal level. I think that works. I think that works a whole lot for how the Adolescence of Utena uses the Castle of Eternity, locking away the power to revolutionize the world. And I think that the character of Utena, through the events of the film, specifically the ones we'll see in this episode, does challenge Anthe and forces Anthe to really question that belief, that acting how she has always acted and continuing to stay in that mindset will ever lead to the power to revolutionize the world. I think that is why Anthe was so surprised when she saw Dios in Utena during the duel. And I think that the incredibly painful process of finding the key, starting the car, and rejecting the social systems that have become so ingrained in a part of Anthe's self-worth and self-evaluation are all a result of her deeply held belief of the Castle of Eternity equating to the power to revolutionize the world via the social system of the prince, clashing up against Utena's internal value scheme, her inner strength and nobility, and the relationship that she has developed with Anthe. And the reason I kind of wanted to save it for the Castle of Eternity on the chase scene on the highway is because I think you see this a bit more, especially when Anthe rejects Akio and then the Castle of Eternity crumbles. Because in that moment, the power to revolutionize the world is realized, and it's de-glamorized. It's demystified. It's not made into this giant mystical place that's beyond mere human understanding. Instead, the power to revolutionize the world is just the incredibly powerful, incredibly painful realization that life is what you make it, and no one can ever forcefully deliver that to you. The Castle of Eternity and the power to revolutionize the world is Anthe's excuse for being too weak to leave Otri Academy. Coming back into the narrative, Anthe faces the accusations from Shiori. So even though she defended against it a bit, she's still exposed and public opinion turns against her, and she clearly vanishes. Utena chases after her, turning into Dios again, signifying that her intentions here are purely in line with the concept of the prince, or the ideals that the prince represents. In this transitionary scene, we see a lot of architectural stuff going on. Otri Academy kind of opens up and embraces its inner labyrinth here. It's actually a very good place to run and hide if you need that, or perhaps it becomes a very good place to hide. Anthe's obviously trying to create a lot of distance between herself and society. Utena is taking it upon herself to bridge that. There's the sunset, but I don't know that that has a ton of significance other than kind of bringing it in tonally to a more reclusive and introverted scene, sort of like how it was in the Rose Garden at night, the previous night. They're closing off, their performances are ending, and the interpersonal relations are kind of fading and giving way to the introspective darkness. And we've got the hard cut here to the memory. This is a tough one because it doesn't give us any context for how this memory is coming up or being exposed. Is this only Anthe recalling what she went through? Is this Utena, who we had just seen, recalling this information that was shared with her earlier? We don't even know if Utena knows about this part of the scene. Presumably we do because she has the scar, or she has the hole in her chest, and this is where that comes from. So let's read it as that Utena is remembering this. So that's probably why there's no cut back to Anthe or any other contextual information there, and why this flashback scene is kind of bookended with Utena going in and then Utena again when we come out of it. The framing's great coming into this with the rack focus on the water glasses, so we're further confirmed that we're a third party. We're not seeing this from either Akio or Anthe's point of view, so it's likely Utena reviewing this memory. Add on to that one of the water glasses is empty, and it's the one that was closer to the camera on the table, which when we saw it in the previous scene was the one that had the date rape drug dropped into it. Clearly places it temporally, which places it after the events of the previous flashback, which isn't too much of a leap considering it happens after it in the film. But it does indicate that Anthe, who had been aware that she was being drugged, went along with it, which is very much in line with her forcing Akio to play the prince, her being passive and submissive, and fits real nicely with her line here, "Don't worry, you are my prince. You can do with me what you please, you can do anything." It very much calls back to the relationship between Anthe and Akio we talked about before, of her forcing him into the role of the prince, even though that's not a sustainable thing, and, his failure to embody the ideals of the prince. And I think his suicide is very much because he cannot live up to those ideals. And a lot of Anthe's sin is forcing him to engage in that. And it's definitely worse than, vilifying him. I think had she hated him and denied him the label of the prince after what he did to her, and perhaps he even did it to her to get that denial or to escape being the prince, then that would have been a much kinder fate than being forced to play the prince in spite of his terrible deeds. So yeah, I definitely see Akio's suicide as a rational action here, rather than bear the impossible burden of being perceived as perfect, full well acknowledging that you do not live up to those ideals. It's much easier to deny that with actions, and when that fails, to just escape entirely. But here, we come to a very interesting point, and Akio brings up the idea of the key first. This ties in nicely to his suicide. If he can't live up to those ideals and he can't shed himself of them within Otri Academy or, within the world that he's currently in, why can't he leave, much like Anthe does later on? Divorced from the semiotics of everything, why can't he rise above needing the idea of the prince or being beholden to it and redefine his own terms and become an adult and then rid himself of the social structure that embodies the prince? Well, within the confines of the metaphor, it's the key. He doesn't have the key. He can't escape. It's interesting that finding the key is kind of his last-ditch effort before his final act of suicide, indicating that if he found the key, he wouldn't have killed himself, but also indicating that he knew he wasn't able to escape after Anthe refused to allow him to stop being the prince, but even then, a key would let him escape. So he doesn't have it, but he knows that it's valuable for getting out of this social structure of the prince. And of course, that brings up the obvious question of what is the key? We had a great, hour-long discussion with Only in Themes and my friend Kura in our Discord. And one of the things Anthe brought up was he wasn't really sure what the key is. And yeah, I definitely think it's very crucial to the film to figure out what the key is and what that means. But I don't think it's something that, necessarily has that tight one-to-one equation. So I think it's easier to think about what the key is, but if we look backwards, who do we know that has a key? Well, this is actually literally shown on screen. We know that later on Anthe has one. But you'll remember when we get there, the key, before Utena transforms into a car, is the mark of the rose that Anthe rips from Utena's finger as she tries to get her to leave. The key is literally the mark of the rose. This is further enforced later on when Juri, Miki, and Seonji are riding in the Wakaba Jeep. They all have the mark of the rose. They have the key. So we know of 4 people that have the key. 2 that don't, Shiori and Akio. And then 1 that gets the key from somebody else, Anthe. So let's reframe the question of what is the key to what do the 4 duelists exhibit that Anthe learns over the course of the film, or gains over the course of the film, but Akio and Shiori never do. Oh, and I don't want to overlook one. Toga also bears the mark of the rose. At least that is in Utena's mind. I did a bit of extra research on this one and went back to the director's commentary for the Adolescence of Utena that's included with the Blu-ray release. And if you have the chance, I definitely wouldn't. It's one of the worst director's commentaries I've ever heard in my entire life. Ikuni is very notorious for hating the Word of God stuff. And all throughout the director's commentary, he says stuff that's either blindingly obvious or just complete bullshit. He does mention that Juri is specifically set up to contrast with Utena, and that Shiori is specifically set up to contrast with Anthe. And he makes the comparison that both of them feel like they're possessed by something, and they're scared of it, but they're unable to act on it. And that's not entirely true. In fact, all the events of the movie are entirely their actions, with a little bit of Utena thrown in there. But I do think there's something here that Shiori and Anthe are not able to do until Utena enables Anthe to do it. And I think it really has to do with the actions or the initiative. And maybe it's the self-respect, maybe it's the nobility or high goals that are inherent to Utena and to the other duelists as well. And I say that specifically because we see that the knowledge of wanting or the knowledge of how the social structure works, and the desire to be above it or without it is not enough to grant somebody a ring or a key. Otherwise, Akio would have found a key, and otherwise, Anthy and Shiori would have one. So it's not just knowledge, it's not just power, whatever that means, and it's certainly not just desire. Instead, it's something a little more ephemeral, something like purpose or courage or the willingness to embrace the difficulty and the burden, the ability to own up to it and face it head on and accept that challenge. Of what? Of your inner demons, of the need to overcome, the challenge of, existence, the challenge of growing up, the challenge of living. That fits well with Shiori and Anthy and Akio, who all three reject that and decide that they can't move on or they can't move past it. They run away from it and hide. And it fits well with Toga, too, that he didn't cower from what was presented with him. He chose a noble goal and pursued it head first and straight on. The whole issue that we see with the duelists is not that they're scared to fight, but instead that they don't really know the right way to go about it or what they should be fighting, or that they get distracted along the way and lose focus. Shiori and Anthy know the way. They're just far too weak to go pursue it. That's my take on the key. Not something that's very reducible or pithy, but I think a very core element of this series and of this movie particularly. Let's move on and get a little more into the shot by shot here. We've got Utena again completely out of breath, not because of the duel, but because of, reaching back into these memories and dealing with these things is more difficult. I don't necessarily think that the car horn here or the signs being set up in a way to point Utena towards the elevator scene with Toga is necessarily an, kind of like intent of a higher power, or that it's purposefully put there because she's necessarily chasing Anthy down the recesses of her private quarters and private mind. They're in inner depths of the soul and all that kind of metaphorical mumbo jumbo. Instead, I very much think that this is more of a direct callback to the Black Rose arc and just using that group of symbols and design choices that kind of really worked for the structure of getting at somebody's inner trauma. I guess you could interpret that as Utena stumbling through to try and get at Anthy's trauma and, ending up at her own accidentally, as that really removes the intent that would otherwise kind of crop up here. And I'm okay with that explanation because it's fair enough to assume that that would happen when Utena is exposed and thinking about hidden revelations, dark secrets, and whatnot. The sign reads, "Engaged couples, please wait in the back," or something along those lines. I'm very unsure on this one. The only thing I could possibly think is that if you're content with being, together with Anthy in this world, then, stay back, don't come in. Still, I'd much rather hear your takes on these. So if you got something better for this sign, let me hear it. And then we come to the elevator scene. While we can talk a lot about its position in the greater context of the film, I do want to say that this scene independently is absolutely fantastic. I mean, the metaphor of descending down the elevator and being closed off is incredibly fantastic in the Black Rose arc and doesn't need to change at all because Utena's going through the same thing that all the duelists in the Black Rose arc went through. And it's a pretty straightforward symbol, right? It's kind of hard to misinterpret the descent of the elevator when it's coupled so closely with this interview type situation. And I think you get this beautiful shot here of the blackness on either side, the clear white line partition between them, and Toga standing. It's definitely got a confessional angle. It's definitely got a interrogation angle. And if we connect it back to what we know about the Black Rose arc, it's kind of imbued with this aura of death. And for what it's worth, the dialogue here is exactly as straightforward as the visual metaphor is. Utena asks about Anthy. Toga says, "Do you still want the power to revolutionize the world?" Which, if you remember, was what Anthy said Utena should be fighting for. And I think that way of opening the scene really aids in, the transition between going from Anthy and talking about Anthy to really talking about Utena in kind of a whiplash way. She's looking to exorcise some demons or banish some ghosts, but she couldn't get to Anthy. Anthy closed herself off, and Utena found herself face to face with her own instead. And Toga just dumps this exposition. He clarifies everything that's going on here. Remember, Toga is an extension of Utena's, inner mind. she knows this already, so she's just facing it. She's just having herself say it to herself. She's consciously recognizing what she already knows. As clear as day, Toga says, "What are these duels for? Everything here is built around the prince, but there is no prince." So the duels, the desire to be the prince, is necessary to keep the idea of the prince alive. It's kind of one of the reasons why I really like this film, because there is no cackling bad guy, or not even a Cube level antagonist that you can point to and say, oh, if this guy didn't show up. When you're fighting against society or self-imposed limitations, that's hard for people to understand. That's difficult. You can't make a blockbuster out of that. People would be too confused. And in the exact same vein, it's difficult for Utena to come to grips with. But I think because of that, it says something, or it gives us a story that is more true to life than any kind of, evil villain fighting against, or, rebellion stories like Star Wars Defeat the Evil type canonical Joseph Campbell wrote thing could ever really be. And there's a bit of blame put at the feet of Anthe, too. She established the Castle of Eternity. The whole Castle of Eternity shtick is just how another facet of the idea of the prince that Anthe uses to establish Otri Academy, and in this place where she's comfortable or doesn't have to be challenged or can exist as the Rose Bride in her complacency and in her pain and in her loneliness. And Utena's final realization that there was never a real prince to begin with. You don't kill a prince. The prince is an idea. You simply realize that it was never the truth. We get the flashback here. It's kind of reminiscent to the prior flashback about Toga's backstory. Again, we get the washed out colors and the grainy film look. The glare from the sun also gives it kind of an idyllic quality. I don't know that there's too much into the idea that Toga is the one who's viewing it, or that he's doing it through a hole in the elevator. I guess it's to create some sort of distance and position the memory as kind of coming back in. And I think what's really good here is that when Utena starts to remember it and say it out loud that a boy drowned, and Toga says, well, maybe that happened. Because Toga here is the manifestation of Utena's idea of the prince, and he has been all along, of course. So in some ways, he's kind of opposed to the truth, just out of the necessity of his existence. The prince, or buying into the idea of the prince, requires a suspension of disbelief from the truth of the actual facts. That's why Utena's so shocked when she realizes that's what actually happened, instead of, what she had convinced herself happened, that Toga was going to be this charming and dashing prince instead of just a boy who did one very courageous act. Toga necessarily realizes what's happening, that he's vanishing, that he's losing his power. And so he pleads with Utena, and it's not in a malicious way or any type of violence, but in much the same way that Anthe embraces the concept of the prince. That's what Toga offers to Utena in this scene here, and what she necessarily rejects in order to be able to turn into the car and leave. And I think the rest of the visual metaphor in this scene is very, very straightforward, but very, very beautiful. The escalating water level as he drowns, kind of the cashing in of all those transitions with the boy's shoe and the bubbles, and really everything about Toga's whole transformation of character from the series to now. The music reprise from the series coming back in, sharing the kiss as his part of the elevator is turned into an infinite void of blackness. And here's the kicker, Utena saying, "Thank you, Toga, you really were my prince." The prince can't exist in the real world, or in any one person, and we found that, and we know that to be true. However, he can exist as a concept and as a memory. And this is the critical catch-22 of the prince, I suppose, and one that you see in the series just as much with Akio and Dios and all of that as a concept he can remain perfect and true to the concept, but in the real world he'll necessarily be fallible. But a person can have power, can influence change. An idea can't do that by itself. I like to call this the objectification of the prince. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot for a lot of different meanings, but I think it very much applies to the boy that was Toga. That he exhibited some chivalrous qualities, that the scene in the church from the series where he befriended a young Utena definitely happened, right? She says that here. And also that he selflessly helped somebody else and gave his own life to save a drowning girl. That caused Utena to rip those qualities out from the person that he was in whole, and take them and transform them into the idea of the prince. And perhaps that's good. I mean, it certainly caused Utena to go forward with her adolescence or arrive at O3 Academy or, have a lot of positive values. I don't think that the show necessarily says that the prince on its own is bad. But instead, I think it says the objectification of the prince as a way to not face reality or to limit yourself and become complacent. That is the real danger. There's a great pacing here with the wind down from that climax, which really tells the viewer that something important has happened there, along with the music. And we see Utena's resolve. I think the framing's very important when she turns to the camera too, that, the darkness has been pushed back and she's surrounded by the white, and we don't really see too much black in her anymore, and it's all very pink and white and light. That harsh color dichotomy, the blacks contrasted and slashing through the whites, to indicate the confusion, is all gone now because it's necessarily gone from her character. And not just calling back to that color theory, but also calling back to the directionality of the up and down from earlier. One of my favorite points in this film every time I watch it is that reveal of the elevator opening up and then her being up at the top, back at the Rose Garden, indicating, this kind of high-mindedness of the goals, of the aspirations of going up, as a result of her descending into her inner depths and hidden secrets. It's like the riddle from Game of Thrones: to go north, you must go south, and to rise above, you have to dig into the depths. The Rose Garden's necessarily a place that's above O3 Academy, except in the next scene, which we'll see. And the pride of placing it up so high is kind of part of the conceit, that ties back into the idea of the prince. And that idea is furthered by the metaphor here of the rose petals falling up. You remember in the dance scene, the petals were pushed away and fell down, and we've established the red roses with the idea of the prince very heavily, but then they're flying away, they're flying up. So this is the highest moment, and especially in Anthe's mind, by what she says of making Utena her new prince, right? She's objectifying her. She's forcing her into the role that Akio failed to fill, and of course Utena would necessarily fail to fill if she stayed with Anthe. And kind of the overpowering of the roses in that situation is a symbol of that. And just the contrast between the dancing scene and the symbol there and the actions that Anthe takes there to appreciate Utena as a person in whole and deal with her and help her as a person, and then here to force her into the role of being the prince. It's so completely different. Of course, Utena understood what just happened with Toga and, everything that went on there. And she absolutely understands that Anthe is using the prince and the reward of the Castle of Eternity to stay complacent and stay in her self-imposed hell. And it's up to Utena to get her out of it. No, that's wrong. It's up to Anthe to get herself out of it, but Utena has to demonstrate that she has a different value system now. So Anthe offers up the symbols of the prince, the sexuality of touching Utena's hand to her breast, of withdrawing the sword, and of course Utena rejects it. She doesn't say anything, she doesn't argue, she doesn't do anything other than let's go to the outside world. And she just takes her and runs. Of course to the left, the directionality we were talking about earlier, and we get the beginning of the car transformation. One thing I do want to say about this scene very quickly before we go is that the character models, or the characters, are drawn slightly different here. There's these harsh, bold lines and kind of a more intense, full coloring to it, and it goes along with the lighting of the pale rose sky. But in shots like this, with Utena's face, you can just see the contrast. You can see the passion right there in her face. And so this scene is really great because it sets up a contrast between the relationship that Anthe and Utena have fostered over the course of the series, revealing their secrets, having those intricate moments like the dance and in the duels, and directly opposing that with Anthe's, self-imposed limits, or, her entire world that she's constructed around the idea of the prince. And I'll tell you what the most unsatisfying thing possible would be, and that would just be Anthe saying, okay, Utena, let's go. And, and not having to go through this whole, next 20 minutes of the film. Because Utena earned it, right? She faced down her demons. But Anthe still has so much fear and so much pain that she's still not willing to, fight on her own. That in this moment, that takes priority. That overcomes even everything, all the faith she has in Utena. And of course, the directing here and storyboarding is top fucking notch. Like the pole that Anthe clings on to visibly rip her apart from Utena, the way the shots are set up with, her arm reaching out to her, but being cut off by the screen, and the contrast between them being together earlier. It's just completely masterful. So in the next episode, of course, we're going to talk about the famous car transformation sequence and the escape scene, and probably try and close it out. Maybe we'll make it a long episode. But in closing for this bit, I really love the tough question that Anthe's given in this scene here, but also how Ikehara goes about tackling a very difficult situation when you know something is wrong and you believe it to be wrong, or you believe somebody to be hurting themselves. Then when do you, as somebody who cares about that person, step in? Kind of the intervention question. And like, what is your process for doing that? And in this scene here, we see Utena, and maybe this is just, Utena as Utena's personality. She has a very unique personality in a lot of ways, very straightforward. But she doesn't even address it. She doesn't even say, Anthe, you're keeping yourself in this place. You have to wake up. You have to realize that this isn't all life is. She doesn't do any of that. She says, come on, Anthe. Come on, we're leaving. We're going. And I guess that's a bit of knowing Anthe as well, because Anthe's critical flaw is that she lacks the initiative, right? She doesn't have the key. She doesn't have that rose ring. She has all the knowledge and all the power to do it. She just doesn't do it. So I wonder if this type of message would extend to somebody else as well, or is this how Ikehara is saying that we should convey to others to better themselves, to say, I'm rising above, but I want you with me, come on, let's go, and nothing further than that. Show with your actions and not with your words. Something to think about. Anyway, join us for the next episode where we try and wrap up the Adolescence of Utena.